Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her palm against the reinforced transparent aluminum barrier and watched the creature pace in its enclosure. 3 meters tall, covered in midnight black fur that seemed to absorb light itself, the Vorthak warrior moved with predatory grace that made her heart race. Its yellow eyes tracked every movement in the observation deck above, and when those eyes met hers, Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You're insane if you think you can work with that thing," Director Kowalski said behind her, his voice tight with concern. "The Galactic Council specifically warned us about Vorthak behavioral patterns. They're apex predators, Sarah. In their home system, they hunt in packs and can tear through starship hulls with their bare claws." Sarah didn't turn away from the observation window. The Vorthak had stopped pacing and now stood directly below her, its massive head tilted upward. She could see the intelligence burning in those alien eyes, could see the way its nostrils flared as it tested the air currents. Most people saw only a monster when they looked at the creature. Sarah saw something else entirely. "His name is Kaveth," she said quietly. "According to the transport records, he was captured during the border conflicts 3 months ago. He's been in isolation chambers ever since. It doesn't have a name, it has a designation number," Kowalski snapped. "X-47 Alpha. And it's been in isolation because every attempt at interaction has resulted in injury or death. The Centaurian handlers who brought him here lasted exactly 47 minutes before one of them lost an arm." Sarah finally turned to face her director. She'd worked at the Terran Xenobiological Preserve for 6 years, ever since completing her doctorate in alien behavioral psychology. In that time, she'd successfully rehabilitated dozens of species that others had written off as too dangerous or too alien to understand. The key was always the same: patience, respect, and the willingness to see beyond surface behaviors to underlying needs. "The Centaurians used shock prods and neural dampeners," Sarah said. "They treated him like a wild animal instead of a sentient being. Look at his enclosure, Director. No environmental enrichment, no stimulation, no attempt to replicate his natural habitat. He's going insane in there." Kowalski gestured toward the creature below them. As if sensing their attention, Kaveth let out a low growl that vibrated through the reinforced walls. "That thing killed 16 Terran soldiers during the war. It's a living weapon, not a pet project for your rehabilitation theories." "He was a soldier defending his territory," Sarah corrected. "The war is over. The peace treaties are signed. If we're going to share this galaxy with the Vorthak, we need to understand them better than just their capacity for violence." The director shook his head. "The board will never approve direct contact protocols. The insurance alone would bankrupt us, not to mention the legal liability if you get yourself killed." Sarah turned back to the observation window. Kaveth had moved to the far corner of his enclosure, where he'd arranged the few metal fixtures into what almost looked like a nest. She'd noticed him doing this over the past week. Always in the same corner, always facing the same direction. It reminded her of pack animals establishing territory markers. "I'm not talking about direct contact yet," she said. "Start with environmental modifications. Let me study his behavioral patterns, establish some basic communication protocols. The Vorthak have a complex social structure according to the xenoanthropology reports. They're not mindless killers. They're werewolves from hell," Kowalski muttered. But Sarah caught the slight softening in his tone. "What kind of environmental modifications?" Sarah had been preparing for this question. She pulled out her tablet and scrolled through her preliminary observations. Temperature variance for starters. His homeworld has significant daily temperature fluctuations. This enclosure is kept at a constant 22 degrees Celsius. Also, the lighting is all wrong. Vorthak eyes are adapted for low light conditions with specific wavelength sensitivities. She pointed toward Kaveth's makeshift nest. "See how he's positioned himself? He's trying to create sight lines and escape routes, but the current layout doesn't allow for proper territorial establishment. We need elevated platforms, hiding spaces, and environmental complexity." Kowalski was quiet for a long moment, watching the alien warrior below. Finally, he sighed. "You have 2 weeks to show me measurable behavioral improvements. No direct contact, no attempts at physical interaction. If he so much as charges the barrier while you're in the observation area, the project gets shut down immediately." "Understood," Sarah said, already mentally cataloging the modifications she would need to implement. As Kowalski left the observation deck, Sarah remained at the window. Kaveth had moved again, this time settling into what appeared to be a meditative position near the center of his enclosure. His massive chest rose and fell in slow, controlled rhythms, and his ears twitched occasionally as he tracked sounds from throughout the facility. "I know you can understand me," Sarah said quietly, placing her hand on the barrier again. "I don't know how much standard you've picked up, but I know you're listening." Kaveth's ear twitched in her direction, though he didn't open his eyes or change position. "Things are going to change around here," she continued. "No more shock prods, no more isolation. You're going to hate me at first because change is stressful. But I promise you this, I will never hurt you, and I will never let anyone else hurt you either." The alien's breathing pattern shifted slightly, and Sarah felt a small surge of hope. She had 2 weeks to prove that humans could succeed where other species had failed. 2 weeks to show that understanding and compassion could bridge the gap between species that had been at war less than a year ago. 2 weeks to prove that only a foolish human would dare to see a person where everyone else saw only a monster. Sarah arrived at the facility before dawn, her arms loaded with equipment requisitions and environmental modification plans. The maintenance crew had worked through the night implementing her initial changes, and she was eager to see Kaveth's reaction to his transformed enclosure. The moment she entered the observation deck, she knew something was different. The constant pacing had stopped. Instead of the agitated energy that had radiated from the Vorthak for months, there was an almost meditative calm in the air. She found Kaveth perched on one of the new elevated platforms, positioned so he could observe both the main entrance and the observation deck simultaneously. His posture was alert but relaxed, no longer the coiled tension of a caged predator. When he noticed her arrival, his ears swiveled in her direction, and for the first time since his capture, he didn't growl. "Good morning, Kaveth," Sarah said, settling into her observation chair with a cup of coffee. "I see you've been exploring your new accommodations." The platform system had been her first priority. Vorthak were naturally arboreal despite their size, preferring elevated positions that provided tactical advantages. She'd also installed varying light sources that mimicked the dual sun system of his homeworld, creating patches of deep shadow and filtered illumination throughout the enclosure. But the most significant change was the temperature gradient system. Different zones of the enclosure now cycled through temperature ranges that matched the day-night patterns of Vorthak Prime. Already, she could see Kaveth had claimed the coolest section as his primary resting area, with the warmer zones serving as activity spaces. Dr. Marcus Webb, the facility's xenolinguist, joined her on the observation deck. "The overnight sensors picked up some interesting vocalizations," he said, pulling up audio files on his tablet. "Listen to this." The recording played a series of low, harmonic sounds that seemed to follow a complex pattern. To Sarah's ears, it almost sounded like singing. "Vorthak don't just howl," Webb explained. "They have a sophisticated vocal communication system that includes tonal variations and harmonic layering. What you're hearing is called territory song in my translation matrices. He's claiming ownership of his space." Sarah watched Kaveth carefully. The alien had turned toward their conversation, his head tilted in a way that suggested active listening. "How much standard does he understand?" "More than we initially thought. The Vorthak have exceptional auditory processing capabilities. He's probably been learning our language just by listening to facility conversations. The question is whether he'll choose to use it." As if responding to their discussion, Kaveth stood and moved to the section of the barrier closest to the observation deck. He placed one massive clawed hand against the transparent aluminum and looked directly at Sarah. When he spoke, his voice was a deep rumble that seemed to resonate through the reinforced walls. "Who man, female. You changed territory, why?" The words were heavily accented and carefully pronounced but unmistakably standard. Webb nearly dropped his tablet while Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. First contact protocols had assumed that formal communication attempts would take months to establish. "Because you were unhappy," Sarah replied simply, moving closer to the barrier. "You needed space that felt like home." Kaveth's yellow eyes studied her intently. "You are pack leader here?" "I'm a caretaker," Sarah said, choosing her words carefully. "My job is to make sure you're healthy and comfortable while you're here." "While here," Kaveth repeated, and Sarah caught the implicit question in his tone. "The war is over," she explained. "There are negotiations happening between Earth and your homeworld about prisoner exchanges and repatriation. But those talks take time." The alien warrior was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Finally, he asked, You show respect to enemy. This is human way? Sarah felt Webb tense beside her. This was dangerous territory, both diplomatically and personally. But she'd committed to honesty, and Kaveth deserved the truth. You're not my enemy, she said. You were a soldier doing your duty, just like our soldiers were doing theirs. The fighting is finished. Now we learn to understand each other. Kaveth moved away from the barrier and settled back onto his platform, but instead of turning away as he usually did, he remained facing the observation deck. Human female has name? Dr. Sarah Chen, but you can call me Sarah. Sarah, he said, the pronunciation careful and deliberate. I am Kaveth, son of Gromar, pack leader of the 7th Claw. Webb was frantically taking notes, muttering about the significance of Vorthak naming conventions and social hierarchies. But Sarah only had eyes for the alien warrior who had just shared something deeply personal with her. It's an honor to meet you properly, Kaveth, she said. Over the following days, their conversations became routine. Sarah would arrive each morning with updates on his environmental modifications and progress reports on the diplomatic negotiations. Kaveth would share observations about human behavior and occasional stories about his homeworld. She learned that Vorthak society was built around pack structures, but not in the primitive way that xenobiologists had assumed. Their packs were more like military units combined with extended families, with complex hierarchies based on merit rather than brute strength. Kaveth had earned his leadership position through tactical brilliance and protective instincts toward his subordinates. You study pack behavior, Kaveth observed during one of their conversations. You understand territory hierarchy, protection of weak members. This is why you succeed where others fail. Sarah was struck by his insight. He was absolutely right. Her approach to animal rehabilitation had always been based on understanding social structures and environmental needs. She'd simply applied the same principles to an alien species. Most humans see you as a monster, she admitted. They're afraid because you're physically powerful and because we were at war. Fear makes poor decisions, Kaveth said. Fear makes enemies where none exist. You do not fear. I respect you, Sarah corrected. I'm careful but not afraid. There's a difference. Kaveth's ears perked forward, and what she'd learned was a sign of interest or approval. Yes, respect allows understanding. Fear prevents learning. By the end of her second week, Kaveth had transformed from a caged predator into an engaged participant in his own care. He helped identify which environmental modifications were most effective, offered suggestions for improving his diet, and even assisted in creating exercise routines that maintained his physical conditioning. But the most significant change was in the facility staff. Word had spread about the talking werewolf, and gradually the fear-based attitudes began shifting toward curiosity and respect. Other xenobiologists started visiting the observation deck, asking questions about Vorthak culture and society. Sarah realized that she wasn't just rehabilitating Kaveth. She was fundamentally changing how humans perceived an entire species, and judging by Kaveth's growing comfort with human presence, the effect was mutual. News of the Centaurian incident spread through diplomatic channels faster than Sarah had anticipated. Within days, the Terran xenobiological preserve found itself at the center of an interspecies controversy that reached the highest levels of galactic government. Sarah was reviewing behavioral assessment reports when Director Kowalski burst into her office, his face pale with worry. We have a problem. A big one. What now? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. The Vorthak Tribal Council is demanding immediate access to their captured pack leader. They're claiming that our treatment protocols constitute cultural genocide and violation of prisoner of war conventions. Sarah's stomach dropped. They want to take Kaveth? It's worse than that, Kowalski continued. They're threatening to withdraw from all peace negotiations if we don't release him immediately. The Galactic Council is pressuring Earth to comply to avoid restarting the war. Through her office window, Sarah could see media drones hovering around the facility perimeter. The story had attracted attention from news services across 3 star systems, turning Kaveth into an unlikely symbol of post-war reconciliation efforts. There's more, Kowalski said grimly. A Vorthak diplomatic ship arrived in Earth orbit this morning. They're sending a delegation to evaluate Kaveth's condition and negotiate his release. Sarah felt her world tilting. Over the past month, her daily conversations with Kaveth had become the highlight of her work. She'd grown genuinely fond of the alien warrior, And more importantly, she believed their relationship was helping to bridge centuries of mistrust between their species. "When will they arrive?" she asked. "2 hours. And Sarah, they specifically requested that you be present for the evaluation. Apparently, word about your interactions with Kaveth has reached the tribal council." Sarah spent the next hour in Kaveth's observation area, trying to process the implications of what was about to happen. When she explained the situation to him, his reaction surprised her. "This is good development," he said, settling onto his favorite platform. "Tribal council involvement means diplomatic process advances. War peace officially ends." "But they'll take you away," Sarah said, unable to hide the sadness in her voice. Kaveth's ears twitched in what she'd learned was amusement. "Sarah believes Kaveth departure means end of friendship?" "I don't know what it means," Sarah admitted. "I've never had a friend from another species before." "Friendship transcends physical proximity," Kaveth said gently. Sarah taught Kaveth that understanding bridges fear. This lesson continues regardless of location. The Vorthak delegation arrived precisely on schedule. 3 massive aliens in ornate ceremonial armor strode through the facility corridors, their presence commanding immediate respect from human staff members who had never seen free Vorthak before. The delegation leader was introduced as Gromar, High Chieftain of the 7th Claw. Sarah realized with a start that this was Kaveth's father. The family resemblance was unmistakable in their bearing, and the intelligent gleam in their yellow eyes. "You are Dr. Sarah Chen," Gromar said, his standard more fluent than Kaveth's but carrying the same deep, resonant quality. "My son speaks of you in his transmissions." "Transmissions?" Sarah asked, confused. "You did not know?" Gromar seemed surprised. "Vorthak possess natural bioelectric communication capabilities. Kaveth has been sending detailed reports about his experiences to the tribal council since his capture." Sarah felt a mix of betrayal and understanding. Of course, Kaveth had been in contact with his people. It would have been naive to assume otherwise. But the fact that he'd never mentioned it stung. "What did he tell you?" she asked. "That humans possess capacity for honor despite military defeat," Gromar replied. "That one human female showed respect when others showed only fear. That perhaps our species share more similarities than differences." They moved to the observation deck overlooking Kaveth's enclosure. When the warrior spotted his father, he let out a complex vocalization that Sarah had never heard before. Gromar responded with his own call, and the two began a rapid exchange in their native language. "They're discussing pack dynamics and territorial status," Dr. Webb whispered to Sarah. "Kaveth is reporting that he's been treated with honor and respect during his captivity." After several minutes of Vorthak conversation, Gromar turned back to Sarah. "My son requests permission to demonstrate human Vorthak cooperation protocols for the delegation." "What kind of demonstration?" Sarah asked warily. "Direct interaction," Gromar said simply. "He wishes to show that human and Vorthak can share space without conflict." Director Kowalski immediately began protesting about safety protocols and liability issues, but Sarah barely heard him. She was focused on Kaveth, who had moved to the barrier and was watching her with those intelligent yellow eyes. "You want me to come into the enclosure with you?" she asked. "Trust works both directions," Kaveth replied. Sarah trusted Kaveth with respect and dignity. Kaveth trusts Sarah with safety and friendship. The decision should have been difficult. Every safety protocol in the facility was designed to prevent exactly this kind of direct contact with dangerous xenobiological specimens. The insurance implications alone were staggering, but looking at Kaveth, Sarah realized that he'd stopped being a dangerous specimen weeks ago. He'd become a friend, a colleague, and a bridge between their species. If she couldn't trust him now, then everything they'd built together was meaningless. "Open the barrier," she said quietly. "Sarah, you can't be serious," Kowalski protested. "That thing could kill you before security could react." "That thing has a name," Sarah said firmly. "And if he wanted to hurt me, he could have done it any time over the past month. He's had dozens of opportunities." Gromar watched the exchange with obvious interest. "Human pack dynamics differ significantly from Vorthak hierarchies," he observed. "But the underlying principles of trust and loyalty appear consistent across species." With obvious reluctance, security personnel opened the barrier controls. Sarah stepped through the energy field into Kaveth's enclosure, acutely aware that she was now sharing space with a being who could literally tear her apart with his bare hands. Kaveth approached slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. When he stopped just out of arm's reach, Sarah realized that he was giving her space to feel comfortable, demonstrating the same respect for her safety that she'd shown for his dignity. "Hello, friend," she said simply. "Hello, Sarah," Kaveth replied, and for the first time since they'd met, she heard genuine warmth in his voice. They stood together in comfortable silence for several minutes while the Vorthak delegation observed from above. Sarah was surprised by how natural it felt to share space with Kaveth. Despite his imposing size and predatory appearance, his presence was calming rather than threatening. "The demonstration is complete," Gromar announced. "The Tribal Council will be informed that humans possess the capacity for interspecies cooperation and mutual respect." As Sarah prepared to leave the enclosure, Kaveth placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Sarah changed Kaveth's understanding of human nature. Now Kaveth changes Vorthak's understanding of human potential. Circle completes itself. Sarah felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She'd known this moment would come, but actually facing Kaveth's departure felt like losing a member of her family. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "Understanding once shared cannot be unshared," Kaveth said. "Friendship once formed cannot be unformed. Sarah will see Kaveth again in many forms and many places." As she stepped back through the barrier, Sarah realized that Kaveth was right. What they'd accomplished together was bigger than just their personal friendship. They'd proven that enemies could become allies, that fear could transform into understanding, and that sometimes the most foolish actions turned out to be the wisest choices. 3 weeks into the project, Sarah faced her first major crisis. She arrived at the facility to find Director Kowalski pacing anxiously in the corridor outside Kaveth's enclosure, surrounded by a crowd of agitated xenobiologists and security personnel. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, pushing through the group. "We have visitors," Kowalski said grimly. "A Centaurian delegation arrived this morning demanding to inspect our prisoner management protocols. They're particularly interested in X-47 Alpha." Sarah's blood ran cold. The Centaurians had been the primary military contractors during the border conflicts, and their treatment of Vorthak prisoners had been notoriously brutal. They viewed the aliens as little more than savage beasts to be contained through force and intimidation. "They can't just show up and demand access," Sarah protested. "We have protocols, jurisdiction agreements." "They have a Galactic Council mandate," Kowalski replied, handing her an official document. "Something about ensuring proper containment of dangerous xenobiological specimens. They want to observe our interactions with the subject." Through the observation window, Sarah could see Kaveth on his platform. His posture was tense, ears flattened against his skull. He'd clearly sensed the change in atmosphere throughout the facility. When he spotted her, he moved to the barrier with unusual urgency. "Sarah," he called, his voice tight with concern. "Scent markers indicate Centaurian presence. They come for Kaveth?" The fact that he'd immediately identified the species by scent alone wasn't surprising. Vorthak had incredibly sophisticated olfactory senses, but the fear in his voice was something she'd never heard before, and it made her chest tighten with protective anger. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I won't let them hurt you." Kaveth's ears twitched, and he tilted his head in the way that indicated confusion. "You would challenge Centaurians for enemy prisoner?" "You're not a prisoner," Sarah said firmly. "You're a guest here until the diplomatic situation gets resolved. And yes, I would challenge anyone who tried to mistreat you." Before Kaveth could respond, the observation deck door opened and 3 Centaurians entered, followed by Director Kowalski and a nervous-looking security guard. The Centaurians were tall insectoid beings with chitinous exoskeletons and compound eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings. The lead Centaurian, whose uniform markings indicated high rank, clicked his mandibles in what Sarah recognized as dismissive irritation. "This containment protocol is unacceptable," he said in heavily accented standard. "The specimen has been provided with luxury accommodations and social interaction. Such treatment encourages dependency and reduces natural fear responses." "The subject's name is Kaveth," Sarah said, stepping forward. "And these are appropriate environmental enrichments for his species' psychological needs." The Centaurian's compound eyes fixed on her with unsettling intensity. "You address the specimen by designation name," This indicates inappropriate emotional attachment that compromises professional objectivity. It indicates basic respect for a sentient being. Sarah shot back, her temper starting to flare. Sentience is irrelevant, the Centaurian replied. This creature is a captured enemy combatant of extreme dangerous classification. Proper protocol requires isolation, sensory deprivation, and behavioral conditioning through negative reinforcement. Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. That's torture, not containment. It is effective management, the Centaurian corrected. Your primitive human attachment behaviors have created dangerous precedent. We will demonstrate proper techniques. The Centaurian pulled out a device that Sarah recognized with horror as a neural disruptor, the same type of weapon that had been used to torture Vorthak prisoners during the war. Behind the barrier, Kaveth let out a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the entire facility. You will not use that device on him, Sarah said, moving to block the Centaurian's path to the barrier controls. Human female will stand aside, the Centaurian ordered, raising the neural disruptor threateningly. Galactic Council authority supersedes local jurisdiction. Sarah, please step back, Kowalski said urgently. We can't afford an interspecies incident. But Sarah held her ground. She'd made a promise to Kaveth, and she intended to keep it. No, I won't let you hurt him. The standoff might have escalated, but Kaveth's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Sarah, move away from barrier. Sarah turned to look at him, confused. Kaveth was standing at the center of his enclosure, his massive frame radiating controlled power. But his expression was calm, almost serene. Kaveth, I'm not going to let them. Trust pack leader, he said simply. Kaveth understands Centaurian behavior. Show them truth of Vorthak nature. Reluctantly, Sarah stepped aside. The lead Centaurian approached the barrier controls with satisfaction. Neural disruptor ready. Observe proper specimen management, he announced to the assembled humans. He activated the barrier controls and stepped into the enclosure, weapon raised. Specimen will assume submissive position immediately or face corrective stimulation. What happened next would be talked about in xenobiological circles for years to come. Kaveth didn't attack. He didn't snarl or threaten or display any of the aggressive behaviors that the Centaurians expected. Instead, he sat down calmly in the center of his enclosure and began to sing. The territory song that Dr. Webb had recorded weeks earlier filled the air, but this version was different. More complex, more layered, with harmonic frequencies that seemed to resonate in Sarah's bones. It was hauntingly beautiful and utterly unexpected. The Centaurian faltered, clearly confused by this response. Specimen will cease vocalization and comply with containment protocols. Kaveth continued singing, his yellow eyes fixed steadily on the Centaurian. There was no fear in his gaze, no submission, but no aggression either. Just calm, dignified resistance. Use the disruptor, one of the other Centaurians called from the observation deck. But the lead Centaurian hesitated. The neural disruptor was designed to stop charging predators and break down aggressive resistance through pain. It wasn't designed for this situation, where the target was peacefully non-compliant. Using the device now would be the equivalent of torturing a sitting prisoner who wasn't threatening anyone. Even by Centaurian standards, it would cross ethical lines that might have diplomatic consequences. Kaveth's song reached a crescendo, and Sarah realized that other voices had joined in. Throughout the facility, every Vorthak in the collection was singing in harmony, their voices carrying through the walls and corridors. The humans stood transfixed, witnessing something they'd never imagined possible. "This is what you call savage behavior?" Sarah asked the Centaurians quietly. "This is what requires torture to control?" The lead Centaurian lowered his neural disruptor, his compound eyes reflecting uncertainty. For the first time since entering the facility, he seemed to be questioning his assumptions about Vorthak nature. Kaveth brought his song to a gentle close and stood up, moving to face the Centaurian directly. When he spoke, his voice carried the dignity of a military officer addressing a peer. Conflict is finished. Kaveth offers no threat to Centaurian persons or Centaurian territory. Request respectful treatment during diplomatic resolution period. The Centaurian stared at him for a long moment, then slowly backed toward the barrier exit. This requires further evaluation, he said, his voice lacking its earlier certainty. As the Centaurians left the enclosure, Sarah felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Kaveth had just demonstrated something that would change everything. He'd shown that Vorthak were capable of nonviolent resistance, of dignity under pressure, of complex emotional responses that challenged every stereotype about their species. But more than that, he'd trusted her enough to be vulnerable in front of his former enemies. He'd chosen compassion over aggression, understanding over revenge. That was incredible, she whispered. Kaveth approached the barrier where she stood. StorY showed Kaveth that humans choose understanding over fear. Kaveth shows Centaurians that Vorthak choose dignity over violence. Perhaps understanding spreads to all species. Sarah pressed her palm against the barrier, and for the first time, Kaveth placed his massive clawed hand opposite hers. Even through the transparent aluminum, she could feel the warmth of his touch. 6 months after Kaveth's departure, Sarah found herself aboard a Terran diplomatic vessel, approaching Vorthak Prime. The invitation had come directly from the Tribal Council, requesting her presence as a cultural liaison for the first official peace summit between their species. "I still can't believe they asked for you specifically," Ambassador Reynolds said as they watched the alien world grow larger in the viewport. "In 40 years of diplomatic service, I've never seen anything like it." Sarah understood his amazement. Protocol dictated that cultural liaisons should be seasoned diplomats with extensive training in interspecies relations. She was just a xenobiologist who'd happened to befriend a prisoner of war. But the Vorthak had been adamant that Dr. Sarah Chen must be part of the peace delegation. Vorthak Prime was unlike any world Sarah had ever seen. Twin suns cast complex shadows across sprawling forest cities that seemed to grow organically from the massive trees themselves. Vorthak architecture favored elevated platforms and interconnected bridges that allowed movement through the canopy without touching the forest floor. "They're arboreal but not primitive," Dr. Webb observed, studying the sensor readings. "Look at those power distribution networks. They've integrated their technology with the natural ecosystem instead of replacing it." The landing platform was a marvel of bioengineering, seemingly grown from the living wood of an enormous tree. As their shuttle touched down, Sarah could see dozens of Vorthak waiting to greet them. Their ceremonial armor gleamed in the dual sunlight, and their massive forms created an intimidating welcome party. Gromar stepped forward as the delegation disembarked, his presence commanding immediate attention from both species. "Dr. Sarah Chen," he said formally, "the Tribal Council welcomes you to the homeworld of the Vorthak people." "The honor is mine, High Chieftain," Sarah replied, grateful for the diplomatic protocol training she'd received during the journey. But Gromar's formality dissolved into what Sarah had learned to recognize as Vorthak amusement. Kaveth warned that human diplomatic customs would make our greeting unnecessarily formal. He suggested that friends should greet as friends, regardless of species or ceremony. Before Sarah could respond, a familiar voice called her name from the crowd of waiting Vorthak. Kaveth emerged from the group, and Sarah was struck by how different he looked in his natural environment. Gone was the caged predator she'd first met. This was Kaveth in his element, confident and powerful, every inch the pack leader he'd been born to be. "Sarah," he said, approaching with that careful respect that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. "Welcome to Kaveth's home territory." "You look good," Sarah said, meaning it completely. "Really good." "Freedom agrees with all creatures," Kaveth replied, but Kaveth learned that freedom without understanding remains incomplete. StorY helped complete understanding. The delegation was escorted through the forest city to the council chambers, a massive hollow within an ancient tree that served as the seat of Vorthak government. Sarah was amazed by the integration of natural and artificial elements. Bioluminescent panels provided lighting, while living wood had been shaped into functional architecture that breathed with the tree's life rhythms. "Your people are incredible engineers," Sarah commented to Kaveth as they walked. "Vorthak philosophy emphasizes harmony with environment rather than dominance over it," he explained. "Perhaps this is a lesson human species might find valuable." The peace summit itself proved to be unlike any diplomatic gathering Sarah had ever witnessed. Instead of formal negotiations across a conference table, the proceedings took place in a circular chamber where representatives from both species shared stories, cultural demonstrations, and collaborative problem-solving exercises. Sarah found herself serving as more than just a translator. She was a bridge between worldviews, helping humans understand Vorthak pack dynamics while explaining human individualism to aliens who thought primarily in terms of collective responsibility. The concept of personal privacy is difficult for us to comprehend, admitted Gromar during one session. Vorthak consciousness is naturally communal. We share thoughts, emotions, and experiences with our pack members as easily as humans share spoken words. But individual achievement and personal growth are valued in your society, Sarah pointed out. Kaveth earned his leadership position through individual merit, not just pack loyalty. True, Gromar agreed. Perhaps the difference is not as great as it initially appears. Humans achieve individually but benefit collectively. Vorthak think collectively but grow individually. The breakthrough came during the third day of talks, when a crisis developed that threatened to derail the entire peace process. A radical faction of Vorthak, led by a war chief named Torak, arrived at the council chambers demanding that the peace negotiations be abandoned. Humans remain enemies, Torak declared, his massive frame radiating aggression. They seek to weaken Vorthak resolve through false friendship and cultural contamination. This peace is betrayal of warriors who died in honorable battle. The accusation created immediate tension in the chamber. Several human delegates began reaching for communication devices to call their security escorts, while Vorthak council members bristled at the challenge to their authority. But Sarah stood up calmly and walked to the center of the chamber. "War, Chief Torak," she said respectfully. "May I share something with you?" Torak's yellow eyes fixed on her with predatory intensity. Human female speaks to Vorthak warrior? This proves contamination of proper protocols. "This proves evolution of understanding," Sarah replied. 6 months ago, I was afraid to be in the same room as a Vorthak. Today, I consider several Vorthak to be among my closest friends. Not because I've been contaminated, but because I've learned to see beyond surface differences to underlying similarities. She gestured toward Kaveth, who had remained silent during the confrontation. Kaveth taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to do what's right despite fear. He could have killed me dozens of times during his captivity, but he chose understanding over violence. That's not weakness, War Chief. That's the strongest thing I've ever witnessed. Torak's ears twitched with interest despite his aggressive posture. Human female claims understanding of Vorthak nature? I claim understanding of Kaveth's nature, Sarah corrected. And through him, I've learned that Vorthak and humans share the same fundamental values. We both honor courage, loyalty, protection of our people, and the pursuit of honorable goals. The methods might differ, but the underlying principles are identical. Kaveth finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his rank and the wisdom of his experiences. War Chief Torak questions human intentions. Kaveth lived among humans for many months, observed their behavior under stress, witnessed their choices when they believed no one was watching. Some humans choose fear and hatred, yes, but some choose understanding and friendship. Same is true of Vorthak people. The chamber fell silent as Torak considered this challenge to his worldview. Finally, he turned back to Sarah. Human female would stake reputation on truthfulness of this claim? I would stake my life on it, Sarah replied without hesitation. Torak studied her for a long moment, then slowly moved to stand directly in front of her. At close range, his sheer size was overwhelming, but Sarah held her ground. She'd learned that respect was earned through courage, not submission. If human female speaks truth, Torak said finally, then perhaps peace negotiations merit continued consideration. If human female speaks falsehood, consequences will be severe for all involved. I understand the stakes, Sarah said simply. Torak stepped back and addressed the entire chamber. War Chief Torak will observe human behavior during remainder of peace talks. If humans prove worthy of trust, war faction will support treaty. If humans prove unworthy, negotiations end permanently. As the session concluded, Kaveth approached Sarah with obvious pride. Sarah faced down War Chief without showing fear or disrespect. This demonstrates perfect understanding of Vorthak honor codes. I just told the truth, Sarah said, though her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline. Truth requires courage to speak, Kaveth replied. Courage earns respect. Respect enables understanding. Understanding creates peace. Sarah understands the complete cycle. Looking around the chamber at the mixed groups of humans and Vorthak engaged in animated conversations, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted. The Peace Summit was no longer just about ending a war. It was about beginning a friendship between species that could transform the entire galaxy. 1 year after the Peace Summit, Sarah found herself standing in the center of the first joint human-Vorthak research station, orbiting the neutral zone between their territories. The facility was a marvel of cooperative engineering, combining human technological innovation with Vorthak biointegration techniques to create something neither species could have achieved alone. The psychological compatibility assessments are remarkable, Dr. Webb said, reviewing data from their ongoing integration studies. Human Vorthak work teams are showing productivity levels 30% higher than single-species groups. Sarah nodded, watching through the observation deck as mixed teams collaborated on various research projects throughout the station. The sight still amazed her. 6 months ago, most humans had considered Vorthak to be savage monsters. Now they were working side by side on everything from stellar cartography to xenobotanical research. Dr. Chen, please report to Docking Bay 7, came the announcement over the station's communication system. Priority arrival requesting immediate consultation. Sarah made her way through the corridors, noting how naturally human and Vorthak crew members moved around each other. The initial awkwardness had faded as both species learned to accommodate different physical requirements and social customs. Humans had adjusted to Vorthak temperature preferences and communal decision-making processes, while Vorthak had adapted to human privacy needs and individual work styles. At the docking bay, she was surprised to find Kaveth waiting beside a sleek Vorthak courier vessel. His expression was unusually serious, and his ears were flattened in a way that indicated stress or concern. Kaveth, she said, moving to greet him. I wasn't expecting you until next week's cultural exchange program. Emergency situation requires immediate consultation, he said formally, then switched to a more personal tone. Sarah's expertise needed for crisis that threatens all progress made between species. What kind of crisis? Sarah asked, following him toward the courier ship. New alien species has made contact with both human and Vorthak territories, Kaveth explained as they boarded. Species calls themselves the Zerathi. Initial diplomatic contacts have been problematic. The courier ship's interior was configured for both human and Vorthak physiology, with adjustable seating and dual environmental controls. As they departed the research station, Kaveth pulled up holographic displays showing recent intelligence reports. The Zerathi are silicon-based lifeforms from the Andromeda galaxy, he continued. Their psychology appears fundamentally incompatible with carbon-based consciousness. They view organic life as parasitic contamination that must be eliminated for galactic hygiene. Sarah studied the tactical assessments with growing alarm. The Zerathi possessed technology that made both human and Vorthak militaries look primitive by comparison. Their first contact with human colonies had resulted in complete sterilization of 3 settlements. Similar attacks on Vorthak outposts had killed thousands. They're not trying to conquer territory, Sarah realized. They're trying to exterminate all organic life. Exactly, Kaveth confirmed. Neither human nor Vorthak forces can stand against Zerathi technology alone. Galactic Council has requested emergency cooperation between all organic species. But why do they need me? Sarah asked. I'm not a military strategist or weapons designer. Kaveth's ears twitched in the way that indicated complex emotions. Because Zerathi psychology appears similar to human and Vorthak psychology before peace treaty. They view all other species as enemies because they fear contamination. Fear makes poor decisions, creates enemies where none need exist. Sarah felt a chill of understanding. You think the same principles that work between humans and Vorthak might work with the Zerathi? Possibly, Kaveth said. But attempts at communication have failed. Zerathi do not respond to diplomatic contact. They attack immediately upon detecting organic presence. The courier ship's destination was a joint military command station where human and Vorthak forces were coordinating their response to the Zerathi threat. Sarah was impressed by how smoothly the two militaries had integrated. Human tactical efficiency combined with Vorthak pack coordination created a formidable alliance. Admiral Harrison, the station commander, briefed them on the current situation. "We've managed to slow their advance, but we can't stop it. Their shield technology is impenetrable to our weapons, and their own offensive capabilities can sterilize entire planets from orbit." "Have you attempted any form of non-aggressive contact?" Sarah asked. "Every standard first contact protocol," the Admiral replied. "They respond to all communication attempts with immediate attacks. They don't seem interested in negotiation." Sarah studied the tactical displays, noting patterns in Zerathi movements and target selections. "They're not random in their attacks. There's a logic to their choices. They're prioritizing high-population areas and industrial centers. Standard military doctrine for conquest campaigns," offered a Vorthak strategist. "No," Sarah said, her mind racing. "Not conquest, sterilization. They're targeting areas with the highest concentration of organic contamination. From their perspective, they're not attacking enemies, they're cleaning up pollution." Kaveth's ears perked with interest. "Sarah sees different perspective on Zerathi motivations?" "I think they're terrified," Sarah said. "Think about it from their point of view. They encounter organic life that spreads across planets, modifies environments, reproduces exponentially. To a silicon-based consciousness, we probably look like a plague that's infecting the galaxy." Admiral Harrison frowned. "So you're saying they're killing billions of people because they're afraid of germs?" "I'm saying they're killing billions of people because they see billions of people as a threat to galactic ecosystem stability," Sarah corrected. "The same way humans would sterilize a contaminated area to prevent the spread of a dangerous pathogen. Understanding motivation does not provide tactical advantage," the Vorthak strategist pointed out. "Zerathi still possess superior technology and hostile intentions," Sarah turned to Kaveth. "What if hostile intentions are based on incomplete information? What if they don't understand that organic life is sentient rather than parasitic?" "Possible," Kaveth admitted. "But how does one communicate sentience to species that attacks all communication attempts?" Sarah stared at the tactical displays for several minutes, watching the patterns of Zerathi movement and human Vorthak defensive responses. Gradually, an idea began forming in her mind. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, and completely contrary to all military logic. "I need to meet with them face to face," she said finally. The command center fell silent. Admiral Harrison was the first to speak. "Dr. Chen, with respect, that's not possible. They destroy any vessel that approaches their ships." "Not if the vessel doesn't pose a threat," Sarah replied. "What if we sent a single small ship with no weapons, no shields, no defensive capabilities at all? A ship that broadcasts peaceful intentions and requests communication? They would destroy it instantly," the Admiral said. "Maybe," Sarah agreed. "But maybe not. If they're really trying to prevent organic contamination, they might be curious about organic entities that voluntarily approach without aggressive intentions." Kaveth moved to stand beside her. "Sarah proposes to test Zerathi psychological assumptions through personal contact. Same principle that created human Vorthak understanding." "The risk is enormous," Admiral Harrison protested. "We can't authorize a suicide mission based on psychological theory." "You can't authorize it," Sarah said, "but I can volunteer for it. And if I'm right, it might be the only chance we have to prevent a galactic war that we can't win." Looking around the command center at the faces of humans and Vorthak who had learned to work together despite centuries of mistrust, Sarah realized that sometimes the most foolish actions were also the most necessary ones. "Besides," she added with a slight smile, "someone once told me that understanding once shared cannot be unshared. Maybe it's time to test that theory on a galactic scale." Sarah's small, unarmed shuttle drifted toward the massive Zerathi vessel, its hull gleaming like crystalline metal against the starfield. The ship was beautiful in an alien way, all geometric precision and flowing curves that seemed to follow mathematical principles rather than aerodynamic requirements. "Final systems check complete." Kaveth's voice came through the communication array. "All weapon systems removed, defensive shields offline, engines set to minimal thrust. Vessel presents no possible threat profile." broadcasting peaceful intentions on all frequencies. Dr. Webb added from the Joint Command Station. Linguistic algorithms are running continuous translation protocols for any response we receive. Sarah took a deep breath, watching the Zarathi ship grow larger on her view screen. This was either the most important diplomatic contact in galactic history, or an elaborate form of suicide. She'd insisted on making the approach alone, despite arguments from both human and Vorthak commanders. If this goes wrong, she said into her communicator, make sure the records show that both species tried everything possible to achieve peaceful contact. Negative thinking creates negative outcomes, Kaveth replied, and Sarah could hear the warmth in his voice despite the formal military communication protocols. Positive thinking, courage, and understanding create positive outcomes. Sarah has demonstrated this principle repeatedly. The Zarathi ship was enormous up close, easily 10 times the size of Earth's largest vessels. Its surface seemed to pulse with internal light, and Sarah realized that what she'd taken for metal plating was actually a form of living crystal that responded to the ship's silicon-based crew. Her proximity, alarms began chiming as scanning beams swept across her shuttle. The scans were thorough and invasive, probing every system and component with incredible precision. Sarah forced herself to remain calm, knowing that any defensive reaction would confirm Zarathi assumptions about organic hostility. Unknown organic vessel, came a voice that sounded like crystal chimes translated through electronic filters. Explain purpose of contamination approach to sterile zone. Sarah's heart leaped. They were communicating instead of shooting. That was already more progress than any previous contact attempt. This is Dr. Sarah Chen of the Terran-Vorthak Alliance, she replied carefully. I request permission to communicate regarding mutual misunderstanding. Between silicon-based and carbon-based life forms, misunderstanding implies possibility of comprehension, the Zarathi voice replied. Organic contamination cannot comprehend silicon purity. Contamination must be eliminated for galactic health. I comprehend your concern about contamination, Sarah said, but I believe organic life and silicon life can coexist without mutual contamination. We seek to demonstrate non-hostile intentions. There was a long pause before the Zarathi responded. Organic entity claims comprehension of contamination concern. This statement indicates unexpected cognitive complexity. Explain cognitive complexity development. Sarah felt a surge of hope. They were curious rather than immediately hostile. That curiosity was exactly what she'd been counting on. Organic life forms possess individual consciousness and collective intelligence, she explained. We modify environments to support our existence, but we also protect and preserve environments we value. We can learn to limit our expansion and respect silicon-based territory. Environmental modification is contamination by definition, the Zarathi replied. Organic reproduction spreads contamination exponentially. Silicon consciousness cannot coexist with contamination spread. But what if organic consciousness learned to contain itself? Sarah asked. What if we established boundaries that prevented contamination of silicon territories while allowing both forms of life to exist in separate regions? Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could almost feel the alien intelligence processing concepts that had never occurred to them before. Organic entity suggests voluntary restriction of contamination. Spread, the Zarathi voice said finally. This concept requires verification of implementation possibility. Sarah's shuttle was suddenly caught in a tractor beam that pulled her toward an opening in the Zarathi ship's hull. Every instinct screamed at her to resist, but she forced herself to cooperate. This was the moment that would determine whether understanding could bridge even the gap between silicon and carbon consciousness. The interior of the Zarathi ship was unlike anything Sarah had ever imagined. Crystalline structures grew from walls and ceiling in fractal patterns that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The atmosphere was thin and filled with mineral particles that sparkled like diamond dust. 3 Zarathi beings approached her as she stepped from her shuttle. They were humanoid in basic shape but composed entirely of translucent crystal that shifted and flowed like living glass. Their faces were geometric patterns that somehow conveyed intelligence and emotion despite their non-organic nature. Organic entity demonstrates courage by entering silicon environment, the lead Zarathi observed. Courage indicates cognitive complexity beyond contamination parameters. My people call it foolishness, Sarah said with a slight smile. But sometimes foolishness and wisdom look very similar from the outside. The Zerathi tilted their crystalline heads in unison, a gesture that reminded Sarah oddly of Kaveth's ear twitches. Explain foolishness-wisdom correlation in organic consciousness. Foolishness is taking actions that seem dangerous or illogical, Sarah explained. Wisdom is understanding when those dangerous actions are necessary for greater good. Sometimes the same action can be both foolish and wise simultaneously. Paradox indicates complex cognitive processing, another Zerathi observed. Silicon consciousness experiences similar paradoxes in quantum decision matrices. For the next several hours, Sarah found herself engaged in the most extraordinary conversation of her life. The Zerathi were fascinated by organic consciousness concepts like emotion, intuition, and interpersonal relationships. In return, they shared insights about silicon-based perception, quantum awareness, and crystalline memory storage. Organic consciousness shapes reality through belief and intention, Sarah explained. Silicon consciousness calculates reality through logic and mathematics. But both forms of consciousness seek understanding, growth, and harmony with their environment. Harmony requires prevention of contamination, the lead Zerathi insisted, but Sarah detected less certainty in the statement than before. Harmony requires balance, Sarah corrected gently. Organic life and silicon life can achieve balance through mutual respect and voluntary territorial limitations. Neither form of consciousness needs to eliminate the other. The Zerathi exchanged complex harmonic communications that sounded like crystal wind chimes in a mathematical symphony. Finally, the leader turned back to Sarah. Proposal requires experimental verification, they announced. Silicon consciousness will establish trial coexistence zone with organic consciousness. Success of trial determines long-term relationship parameters. Sarah felt tears of relief streaming down her face. You're willing to try peaceful coexistence? Organic entity has demonstrated that contamination consciousness possesses unexpected complexity and honor, the Zerathi replied. Complexity and honor merit experimental consideration rather than immediate elimination. 2 years later, Sarah stood on the observation deck of the first trilateral space station, watching human Vorthak and Zerathi crews working together on joint research projects. The coexistence zone had proved so successful that all three species were establishing permanent diplomatic and scientific partnerships. You accomplished something that military strategists thought impossible, Admiral Harrison said, joining her at the observation window. You turned a potential galactic war into a scientific renaissance. I just did what zookeepers do, Sarah replied, watching Kaveth demonstrate pack hunting strategies to a group of fascinated Zerathi crystallographers. I looked past surface behaviors to understand underlying needs. The Galactic Council is recommending you for the Cross-Species Harmony Award, the Admiral continued. First human ever to receive it. Sarah smiled, remembering her first day in Kaveth's observation area, when everyone thought she was crazy for trying to communicate with a dangerous alien predator. I suppose that makes me officially the galaxy's most foolish zookeeper. From across the station, Kaveth's voice carried over the communication system as he addressed a mixed species assembly. Understanding once shared cannot be unshared. Friendship once formed cannot be unformed. These principles apply to all consciousness types throughout the galaxy. The most foolish zookeeper, Sarah repeated quietly, or maybe just the most necessary one. Through the observation window, she could see stars from 3 different galaxies shining together in the darkness. Somewhere among those stars, other species were probably facing the same choice that humans, Vorthak and Zerathi, had faced: understanding or conflict, cooperation or isolation, wisdom or fear. Sarah hoped that when the time came, they would choose understanding. After all, sometimes the most foolish actions turned out to be the wisest choices, and sometimes a simple zookeeper was exactly what the galaxy needed.